Welcome back to Raul Effect. Today we're uncovering the hidden emotional world of the avoidant heart and why the distance you see isn't always the absence of love, but sometimes the beginning of a profound inner transformation. What if the moment an avoidant pulls away is actually the moment they realize they're deeply in love? What if their silence isn't rejection, but a battle between fear and connection? Stay with me because what you're about to hear could completely change the way you understand avoidant love. When an avoidant starts experiencing real love, it rarely feels peaceful or effortless. Instead, it often creates inner chaos. Inside them, there is a constant battle between the part that deeply longs for connection and the part that has spent years surviving by keeping emotions at a safe distance. Many people believe avoidants are afraid of love itself, but that is only part of the story. What truly frightens them is what genuine love awakens within them. Real love shines a light on emotions they have buried for years. It forces them to face fears, old pain, and unresolved wounds they believed were safely hidden. If someone has built their entire identity around independence, emotional control, and self-protection, allowing another person into those hidden places can feel overwhelming. The moment someone reaches beyond their surface and touches the vulnerable parts they have carefully guarded, their first instinct is often to pull away. That reaction does not automatically mean they do not care. More often, closeness exposes fears of rejection, abandonment, and the belief that complete emotional safety may never exist. This is the painful contradiction inside the avoidant mind. The stronger the emotional bond becomes, the stronger their fear can become as well. You may notice them becoming distant right after moments of deep connection. They may suddenly seem cold just when everything felt closer than ever. Underneath that behavior is often emotional overload rather than emotional absence. Imagine spending years believing that intimacy eventually leads to pain. Then someone enters your life who offers consistency, kindness, affection, and emotional security without trying to control you. Most people would find that comforting. For an avoidant, it can feel unfamiliar enough to be frightening. Part of them desperately wants that love, while another part struggles to believe it can last. That is why they sometimes create distance from the very person who makes them feel most alive. Deep inside, their nervous system still associates vulnerability with danger. Real love challenges the protective identity they have relied on for so long. Their emotional armor slowly begins to crack, and instead of feeling free, they often feel exposed. This explains why their behavior can seem so confusing. One day they are warm, affectionate, and emotionally available. The next they appear detached or unreachable. Internally, two powerful forces are pulling in opposite directions. One wants closeness, while the other wants protection from the risks that closeness brings. Their body still remembers disappointment, heartbreak, and emotional hurt. So whenever love becomes real, they instinctively move back toward distance, because distance once helped them survive. What many people misunderstand is that panic, confusion, and withdrawal often appear because the feelings have become deeper than they expected. Genuine indifference usually feels calm. Real love inside an avoidant often feels messy because it shakes the emotional foundation they built their life around. You awaken something they could no longer ignore, and that loss of control can feel terrifying. Sometimes their distance is not evidence that love disappeared. Sometimes it means love reached places inside them that had been disconnected for years. You are not only activating their avoidance, you are awakening parts of themselves they have spent a lifetime avoiding. As those feelings deepen, subtle changes begin happening beneath the surface. They think about you during quiet moments. They replay conversations long after they end. They reread messages they never responded to. Your presence stays with them even when they try convincing themselves to move on. Love slowly slips through the cracks of the emotional walls they spent years building. Even while resisting it, they cannot completely erase what they feel because authentic love changes people from within. It reshapes how they see themselves and what they believe is possible. If you have experienced the confusing push and pull dynamic with an avoidant, remember that much more may be happening beneath the surface than you can see. You may have become the mirror, reflecting everything they buried emotionally. Their reactions are not always about you. Often they are confronting parts of themselves they never expected to face. Real love rarely begins with perfect comfort. Sometimes it begins with discomfort, emotional struggle, and slow transformation. Old walls begin to weaken, and little by little their heart starts remembering what healthy connection actually feels like. Try not to immediately interpret every period of silence as rejection. Sometimes space becomes part of their internal process. Love is not always expressed through flawless communication. Sometimes it reveals itself through growth, uncertainty, and the difficult work of learning to stay emotionally present. As their feelings become stronger, something important changes. In the beginning, distance is usually about avoiding vulnerability. Later, it often becomes an attempt to protect something that suddenly feels precious. They are no longer running because they do not care. They are running because they care far more than they know how to handle. They begin analyzing every conversation, questioning every decision, wondering whether they are enough or whether they will eventually lose the person who now matters so much. Ironically, the deeper their love becomes, the greater their fear grows, because now they have something meaningful they could lose. Their silence is not empty. It carries emotional weight. Sometimes they step back because the connection affected them more deeply than they are ready to admit. They try to manage overwhelming emotions through distance because vulnerability still feels unfamiliar. That is why their love often appears inconsistent. They move closer, then retreat. They open their heart, then quickly close it again. These shifts are usually not manipulation. They are old survival habits, struggling against a growing desire for genuine connection. For someone with secure attachment, love naturally expands life. For an avoidant, it first feels like a threat to everything that once kept them emotionally safe. Suddenly, another person matters more than they can control, so they withdraw in search of stability. Yet even alone, they rarely escape the connection. They continue carrying it quietly inside themselves. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of avoidant attachment. They create distance not because the relationship lacks meaning, but because it has become deeply meaningful. With time and healing, many begin discovering an important truth. Emotional walls cannot protect love forever. Lasting connection requires trust, honesty, openness, and the courage to remain present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Eventually, they realize that no amount of distance can completely silence a connection that is real. No matter how far they retreat, something inside keeps drawing them back, not from guilt or loneliness, but because the bond itself feels genuine. Love gently keeps inviting them beyond the limits of their comfort zone, encouraging them to trust a little more, stay a little longer, and stop running the moment emotions become real. Slowly, they begin understanding that true safety was never found in emotional control alone. Real security grows through honesty, openness, and vulnerability. The very experiences they spent years avoiding gradually become the foundation of the emotional stability they have always been searching for. That is the quiet but powerful transformation authentic love can create inside an avoidant. They once saw as something dangerous slowly becomes the very thing that teaches them emotional courage. The closeness that once made them want to run begins to feel like something worth protecting by staying present instead of creating distance. Little by little, the relationship no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a reminder of who they are capable of becoming. Instead of only reflecting their fears, it starts reflecting their potential. That is why an avoidant pulling away after moments of intimacy does not always mean they have stopped caring. Sometimes it simply means love is trying to grow inside a nervous system that has never fully learned how to handle emotional vulnerability. A heart that spent years staying closed is doing its best to process feelings that seem bigger than anything it has experienced before. Real love does not always make an avoidant leave because they want to escape the relationship. Often, they step back because the connection has become so meaningful that they fear damaging or losing it. That instinct to protect through distance is often one of the earliest signs that something inside them is beginning to change. Everything starts shifting when they slowly realize that love is not an enemy they must defend themselves against. Instead, it becomes a source of emotional support. Genuine love never forces transformation. It quietly teaches them that the safety they spent years searching for through distance may have been found in healthy connection all along. As this transformation continues, another quiet change often appears. They begin mirroring the person they love. This usually happens without conscious effort or intention. Their nervous system naturally starts adapting to someone it now sees as emotionally important. You may notice their tone becoming softer, their communication changing, or their emotional pace beginning to resemble yours. Without realizing it, they absorb the way you create calm, security, and emotional balance. This matters because avoidants usually protect themselves by keeping emotional influence at a distance. Their independence has always depended on maintaining separation. So when this kind of unconscious mirroring begins, it often means those emotional walls are starting to weaken. It is not manipulation or imitation. It is emotional resonance. Their mind and body are slowly learning what safety feels like by being close to someone who consistently provides it. When you remain calm, they often feel calmer themselves. When you become distant, they notice the shift, even if they never say it out loud. You stop existing only in their daily life and begin existing inside their emotional world as well. Over time, this extends beyond simple behavior. They begin taking more emotional risks. They may initiate conversations more often, become slightly more open, and spend less energy avoiding vulnerability. Every positive experience teaches their nervous system that closeness does not always end in pain. At this stage, love becomes a teacher. It shapes them through repeated experiences rather than through advice or explanations. As the attachment grows deeper, another change begins. Curiosity slowly turns into fear of loss. The question is no longer, can I handle being close? It becomes, what if I lose this? That is when love becomes impossible to dismiss. Emotional detachment no longer works because the feelings have already settled deep inside them. This is where anxiety often enters the avoidant experience. Losing the relationship is no longer just about losing another person. It feels like losing the one connection that awakened emotions they thought they would never experience again. For many avoidants, this creates a profound identity shift. The belief that they never needed emotional closeness begins falling apart because their own heart proves otherwise. Even when they create distance, the connection continues living inside them. Certain memories replay over and over. Conversations repeat in their mind. Emotional moments stay with them far longer than they expected. What happened was more than simple attachment. The relationship reached beneath years of emotional protection and touched parts of them they had disconnected from a long time ago. Once those hidden places have been awakened, they cannot simply return to how they were before. When an avoidant reaches the point of truly loving someone, they experience much more than comfort or affection. They face an emotional contradiction that challenges everything they believed about themselves. They meet someone who stayed close without trying to control them, someone who did not run when their walls appeared, someone whose steady presence quietly demonstrated that intimacy does not have to mean losing freedom or becoming trapped. That realization is incredibly unsettling because it exposes the truth they spent years avoiding. Their emotional distance was never evidence of strength. It was a survival strategy built to protect them from rejection, disappointment, and overwhelming emotions. But after experiencing genuine connection, those old defenses begin feeling less like protection and more like a prison. What once gave them a sense of control slowly starts feeling limiting. This helps explain why avoidants often struggle deeply after losing someone they truly loved. From the outside, they may appear calm, composed, or emotionally unaffected. Inside, however, they are often experiencing intense emotional conflict. The structure that once kept them emotionally safe begins breaking apart because they have now experienced what real security, acceptance, and connection actually feel like. Once that experience becomes part of them, it cannot simply be erased. Their fear of losing the relationship becomes overwhelming, not only because they are attached to the person, but because the relationship forces them to see themselves differently. They begin realizing that love is not something that can be controlled, negotiated, or carefully managed. It is living, unpredictable, and deeply transformative. To fully experience it, they must embrace something that has always felt frightening, letting go of constant emotional control. For someone who survived by containing every vulnerable feeling, surrender can feel terrifying. That naturally raises an important question. If they loved so deeply, why did they still create distance instead of holding on? The answer is painful but simple. They were not running from the love itself. They were running from the overwhelming emotions that love awakened inside them before they had learned how to carry them. The closer someone gets to an avoidant, the more emotionally exposed they begin to feel. And in their inner world, vulnerability has long been connected with danger. So their instinct is to do what has always helped them cope. They create distance. But this time, stepping away does not bring the comfort it once did. Instead of relief, they feel an unexpected emptiness. The silence that used to feel safe now feels lonely. The distance that once gave them control now reminds them of what is missing. This is one of the greatest contradictions within the avoidant mind. The emotional fortress they built to protect themselves slowly turns into a place that feels isolating rather than secure. As this realization grows, something begins changing inside them. They discover that no amount of emotional control can replace the peace they briefly experienced when they allowed themselves to be fully open with someone. That awareness does not create instant transformation, but it quietly plants the seed of change. Little by little, fear starts losing its grip because a new fear takes its place. Losing the person who made them feel emotionally alive becomes more frightening than allowing themselves to be vulnerable. At that point, love becomes more than just an emotion. It begins challenging everything they believed about themselves and how relationships work. Without even realizing it, they start evolving. That evolution is not always obvious. They may never become highly expressive overnight, and they may still struggle to put deep emotions into words. Instead, their love often appears through consistent actions rather than emotional speeches. They check in without being reminded. They remember the small things you casually mentioned. They show up when their presence matters most. They offer quiet reliability instead of dramatic declarations. These gestures may seem ordinary, but for an avoidant, they often carry tremendous emotional meaning. This is not a lack of love. It is the safest way they know how to express it. Speaking openly about emotions can still feel risky, while showing care through actions feels more manageable. That is why avoidants are so often misunderstood. Many people expect constant verbal reassurance, but avoidants frequently communicate love through quiet consistency. Their feelings are not necessarily smaller. Their way of expressing them is simply filtered through years of emotional self-protection. When emotional safety continues over time, another beautiful shift begins. Their affection becomes less guarded and more natural. Their choices become less driven by fear and more guided by genuine emotional attachment. This is the point where connection stops being about survival and starts becoming about participation. Love is no longer something they carefully manage. It becomes something they allow themselves to experience. None of this develops through pressure, demands, or emotional ultimatums. It grows through patience, consistency, and an environment where vulnerability is welcomed instead of punished. Avoidants rarely transform because someone forces them to. They transform because they finally feel safe enough to experience emotions they once believed they had to avoid. When they stop running, something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. It is not surrender to another person. It is growing awareness. For most of their lives, their automatic response has been to escape emotional intensity. But when they remain present despite feeling uncomfortable, they begin discovering something surprising. Staying does not destroy them. It helps them discover who they really are. They slowly recognize that distance never truly removed their fears. It only delayed facing them. Over time, their nervous system starts building an entirely different understanding. Closeness is not always dangerous. Emotional intimacy does not automatically erase independence. Relationships can exist without losing themselves. This change cannot be learned through logic alone. It happens through repeated emotional experiences. They do not stop avoiding because someone gives them the perfect explanation. They stop because they experience a kind of love that does not demand perfection, manipulate their emotions, or force them to perform. It simply offers steady acceptance. Inside that kind of relationship, fear gradually loses its influence. As fear weakens, awareness becomes stronger. They begin reflecting on themselves more honestly. Communication slowly becomes easier. They take responsibility for emotional habits they once ignored. None of these changes happen overnight, but each small step reveals that something meaningful is happening inside. What seems like minor progress from the outside often represents enormous internal growth. Every moment they choose emotional presence over emotional escape challenges years of old conditioning. This is what real healing actually looks like. It is not living without fear. It is learning to stay connected even while fear still exists. Their avoidant tendencies do not instantly disappear. Instead, they slowly realize those patterns are no longer their only source of safety. Love does not erase their past. It simply reveals what those defenses were trying to protect all along. A wounded heart trying to avoid experiencing the same pain again. When that wounded part finally feels safe enough to remain present, even imperfectly, something remarkable happens. They are no longer only choosing another person. They are choosing a different version of themselves. They begin choosing presence instead of withdrawal, awareness instead of avoidance, connection instead of constant control. Fear has not vanished. Love has simply become stronger than it. That is what real transformation looks like. It is not perfection. It is not instant change. It is the quiet decision to stop running long enough to discover that staying was never the danger they imagined. In many ways, it was the beginning of everything they had been searching for. Ultimately, what you are witnessing in an avoidant is not emotional emptiness, indifference, or an inability to love. You are watching a survival system slowly encounter something it was never prepared for: genuine emotional safety. Real love does not enter their life and immediately make everything peaceful. Instead, it challenges everything they believed about intimacy, protection, and emotional control. It places them in unfamiliar territory where their old coping strategies no longer work the way they once did. That is why their behavior often seems confusing. One moment they are deeply present, warm, and emotionally connected. The next they disappear into silence or distance. Beneath those mixed signals is usually not a lack of feeling. It is an overwhelming amount of feeling meeting a nervous system that has not yet learned how to comfortably hold it. What appears to be rejection is often a mind trying to process emotions that feel unfamiliar, intense, and deeply significant. Yet with time, something powerful begins unfolding. The very love they once feared becomes the force that reshapes their emotional world. Not because anyone forced them to change, but because they finally experienced a different reality. They begin discovering that closeness does not always end in loss. Vulnerability does not always lead to pain. Emotional connection does not have to destroy their independence. Slowly, their defenses lose their power, one small step at a time. Distance no longer feels like protection. It begins feeling like separation. Silence no longer feels like control. It begins feeling like loneliness. Love, once viewed as a threat, gradually reveals itself as something far more trustworthy than fear. That is the moment everything begins changing. When an avoidant chooses to stay, even imperfectly and with hesitation, they are no longer acting only from survival. They are making a conscious choice toward connection. They are choosing awareness instead of escape and presence instead of protection. That shift changes everything. Their fear has not disappeared, but courage has finally begun to grow beside it. Their old patterns may still exist, but they no longer control every decision. And perhaps the greatest truth is this: avoidant love is not the absence of love. It is love delayed by fear. When that fear finally begins to soften, beneath the layers of distance, self-protection, and emotional control, one simple truth is revealed. They were never truly running from love itself. They were running from what it meant to be completely seen. Real love does not erase an avoidant's fears overnight. It gently challenges them, one moment of safety at a time. Behind the silence, the distance, and the mixed signals, there's often a heart learning that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the doorway to genuine connection. If this message gave you a new perspective, let it remind you that true transformation begins the moment fear no longer has the final say. Thank you for watching, Raul, and I'll see you in the next video.